Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third and final Aquinas lecture for the semester here at the Aquinas Institute. For those of you who don't yet know me, my name is Marcus Gibson. I work here at Aquinas, directing the Princeton Initiative in Catholic Thought. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce this evening as our guest speaker, Professor Jeffrey Morrow, who's a professor at Seton Hall University here in New Jersey, where he teaches courses in Catholic theology, including the theology of Pope Benedict XVI, the theology of the Old Testament, the Eucharist, and ecclesiology. And his research focuses on the history of biblical interpretation and theological exegesis. He's particularly interested in the union between Catholic theology and Catholic biblical scholarship. And more recently, his research has focused on the early modern and Enlightenment political background to the rise of the historical critical method in biblical scholarship. He's the recent co-author with John Bergsma of Murmuring Against Moses, The Contentious History and Contested Future of Pentateuchal Studies. Copies available afterwards for those who are interested. And here to speak to us now on the subject of the book on the Pentateuch and the debate on its authorship, please join me now in welcoming Professor Morrow.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Father Zach, and everybody for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's good to be back with you. I think I spoke a couple years ago on the resurrection of Jesus. So I'm going to talk about this text that John Bergsma and I did, Murmuring Against Moses, as it relates to Pentateuchal criticism, as a way of kind of getting into what is a sane engagement with the historical critical method, okay? And so I'm not going to assume everybody knows what these terms are, so I'm going to try to explain them as best as I can. So when we think of history and the Bible, we might think about archaeology, looking at other ancient sources from the time period. These are all good things to do. When we discuss something called the historical critical method, this tends to be an internal literary theory that's not focused so much outside of the text, but vocabulary, style, literary methods within the text. Okay, I'm just going to start with that. So what I'm going to roughly do in the rest of this talk is I want to kind of introduce the topic, how I got into this. Then I will, at some level, summarize the book a little bit, and then we'll just talk about what can we do, because I think historical criticism is a very important method to engage in. I don't want to throw it out. That's very important, I think. Nor do I think the method does what all of its defenders and practitioners claim, or rather assume for it. I don't know if that makes any sense. So hopefully that'll make more sense as we walk through this, and there'll be ample time for questions and responses afterwards. So how did I get into this? Well, actually, part of it comes out of my own kind of background, my own conversion. I went to Miami University of Oxford, Ohio, as a Jewish agnostic. And I began studying comparative religion, ancient languages, and as I began studying this, I started to work with a history professor, Edwin Yamauchi, who happens to be an evangelical Protestant scholar, very competent. And he had done his work at Brandeis University under a famous Jewish scholar of the Bible in the ancient Near East named Cyrus Gordon. And one of the things that typified that school of approaching ancient documents was to start from a fundamental position of trust in the ancient text, learn the languages, and then study the other historical documents from the time. So history and literature became kind of primary. Theology, philosophy, literary methods became secondary, all right? That was not how I learned Bible from most of the Bible scholars I studied from, regardless of where they went, right? So I worked with Jim Hengis, who was at the University of Chicago, Harold Forshee, who studied under G.E. Wright and others at Harvard. And so these scholars were primarily trained in classic literary methods of biblical scholarship. They weren't opposed to history, but their primary focus was on kind of these literary methods. All right? So I came to trust the Bible as a historical text or group of documents from ancient history as fitting very well in their historical context. I'll give just one example since we're going to talk about the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. if you follow the narrative, they purport to come out of mostly the time period of the Israelites in Egypt in the New Kingdom period, right? So mid-second millennium BCE, okay? And so you would expect that it would fit within that historical context. So there have been a number of works that say that they don't, but there have been a number of really important works by Egyptologists like Kenneth Kitchen in England and James Hoffmeyer, who have argued that when you study the Egyptian sources, they do fit really well. I'm just going to point you to 3 of those texts. One's a bit more controversial. It was Kenneth Kitchen's 2003 volume on the reliability of the Old Testament. The other were both published by Oxford University Press, by James Hoffmeyer. The first was his 1997 book, Israel in Egypt, the evidence for the authenticity of the Exodus tradition. And the other he published in 2005, Ancient Israel in the Sinai, the evidence for the authenticity of the wilderness tradition. Now, these are very important books because what he's doing, and he's a very competent scholar of ancient Egypt, what he's doing is he's looking at ancient Egyptian evidence. He's not finding evidence of the Exodus or Moses, but what he's showing is these texts screamingly fit their mid-second millennium BCE context. Why is that significant? And here's why this is significant. As I began studying biblical scholarship, I began to learn that with some exceptions, it almost doesn't matter where you're trained. If you're trained at a primarily secular biblical studies program, a Catholic one, a mainline Protestant one, a Jewish one, with some exceptions, there are specific methods that are going to be assumed for how you read the text. So we're going to talk about the Pentateuch. And so one of the keys that you find in modern biblical interpretation is the denial of the traditional view that the Pentateuch primarily comes from Moses. Right? So God called Moses on Mount Sinai, gave him the law, and that the Pentateuch at some level comes from that time period of Moses' reworking of the traditions of his people and describing his own history, the history he lived through. All right, that, by the 17th century especially, that becomes challenged by a number of mostly political theorists who are engaging in the Bible, but others as well. By the end of the 19th century, in the 1800s, it's becoming increasingly challenged, such that now almost nobody holds that. And we're not going to argue for the traditional view in this book, all right? But there's a couple points, I think, that are important to keep in mind. That gets replaced by primarily literary theories that then make historical claims about the dating of the text. So the bulk of the text then gets pushed after the time of the Babylonian exile. So as opposed to mid-second millennium BCE, it's pushed to after the 6th century BCE, okay, after the Babylonian exile. It also gets fragmented into different sources. Right now, if you talk to scholars of the Pentateuch now, most of them have moved far beyond what we're going to talk about, a documentary view, to what's called a fragmentary view, where you can't even, there's no texts that are behind this. Rather, there are fragments of oral traditions, written sources. There's such a great multiplicity, we wouldn't be able to identify in a few documents what lies behind the traditions here, attributed to Moses and the Israelites, okay? I'm instead going to focus on the textbook version. Why? Because for most of you, that's what you're going to encounter in the classroom. That's what you might encounter in biblical commentaries in parishes, in a synagogue, in whatever church you're at, depending on what commentaries you're using. And so those kind of classic sources attributed mostly to Julius Wellhausen are J, E, D, and P. It's a very important, I'm going to talk about what that is in a second. It's very important, this is an oversimplification. Even in Wellhausen's time, there's a gross oversimplification, right? Because he even posited multiple layers of editing, right? Such that it's very difficult to disentangle even J and E sources, all right? So I want you to be aware this is a gross oversimplification, but it's pretty common in textbooks. It's how I was trained, and it's very easy to teach. So I'm actually going to use the board to describe some of this since I can. Everybody can still hear me, I hope, right? So oversimplifying, J, E, D, and P. All right? And they get their names, right, from various stylistic differences we find in the text. Okay? Objective differences. J is the Yahwist. Okay? J in German pronounced like a Y. This is the Yahwist, and it gets its name from a term, the tetragrammaton, right? The four-letter unpronounceable name in Judaism, Yad He Vav He, right? So why did I write this differently? Right? Semitic languages, as some of you probably know, are written right to left. So the Yad, Y, He, right? H, Vav, Vav, V. That's how I was raised to pronounce it. He, right? H. The W, Yahweh, you'll often hear, Christians, Gentiles, whomever say, right? We don't know how this is pronounced for sure. Only the high priest supposedly said this, right, in the temple, in the inner sanctum on Yom Kippur. But the W, right? This is how it's often pronounced if you learn Hebrew at most universities. It's the Wa, right? And we could talk about the history of that in the 18th century with Johann Michaelis at Göttingen and other places using Arabic as kind of a way of understanding Hebrew pronunciation, which we can talk about, how the Christians don't have to learn from Jews anymore. We can become experts ourselves from living Arabs who speak Arabic. And what do Jews know about pronunciation, that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of problematic personally. Right? There's lots of different ways of pronouncing these texts in Hebrew. But this is a little bit of a digression. But I want to point it out that because God is sometimes spoken of with these four letters, the tetragrammaton, often translated as Lord in English. Right? You have Lord and Lord in all caps. Lord in lowercase is Adonai, and in all caps it's Yad He Vav He. Okay? So God is often spoken of with that name in these texts, like in Genesis 3, right? In Genesis 5, okay? God tends to be depicted anthropomorphically. Think of Genesis 3. We hear God halach, walking in the garden. Okay? Things like that. E is the Elohist. Okay? If the name Yahweh is where we get the Yahwist from, the Elohist comes from using the name Elohim for God. Right? The plural form, actually, it's gods. Right? Elohim is one, so there's one God. But the false gods of the nations, Elohe, right, it's plural. So because God, for example, in Genesis 1 is described as Elohim, earlier thinkers talked about this as E1, and then you have an E2. That eventually becomes the priestly source, which we'll talk about in a second. Right? So Elohim is used for God in E texts and in P texts. In the priestly source, all right? It used to be E1 and E2. It becomes the priestly source and the Elohist. I know this is complicated. For some of you, this might be your first time hearing these things. The southern kingdom, after the kingdom of David splits after King Solomon, the idea is that this Yahwistic texts, these texts come from after that time period, and they support the politics of southern Israel, of Judah. Okay, the Davidic kingdom. And that the E texts are later. God might appear in a dream or through an angel, as opposed to anthropomorphically like a man. And they support the northern kingdom after it's split. That's part of the political historical argument behind the literary features you find here. D is the Deuteronomist. And if you can't read this, you know what my students have to put up with. And this is the bulk of the book of Deuteronomy. Like J, we'll also use Yad He Vav He for God. Okay? And it supports Jerusalem, hence the central sanctuary. Okay? There's some exceptions in the scholarship for where what they do with this, which we can talk about a little bit in a minute. And P is the priestly source. So Genesis 1, for example, Genesis 17, where we have circumcision given. The concerns are priestly, about the Sabbath, priestly ritual. Leviticus is mostly P and H. P gets divided into the holiness code for the lay people and the priestly code for the priests. So this gets kind of complicated, and usually there's layers of editing posited here. What I want to point out is not that this is wrong, okay? But I want to underscore that it's purely hypothetical based on internal clues scholars find in the text. That doesn't mean it's false, okay? But it's not as if we have Genesis 1 free-floating somewhere as a priestly account of creation, and Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. as some other source. The only text I'm aware of that we have of Genesis in Genesis 1 to 3 have them as a whole text in roughly their final form. And there are different manuscript traditions for Genesis. All right, so I'm aware of that. Even in the Hebrew, right, we have Hebrew portions that support a Samaritan reading of Genesis, which we're going to talk a little bit about because we deal with this in the book. We have Hebrew texts that support the sorts of translations we get in the most common Greek translation, the Septuagint. And we have Hebrew portions that are before what you might get in kind of what we call the standardized Hebrew text that most of our English translations are based on, the Masoretic text. They predate the Masoretes, and yet they match that very well, like in the Isaiah scroll, for example. All right, so there's different textual traditions. But what I want to point out, and what we point out in the book, is that they match these sources, right? They have different textual traditions, even in Hebrew, 3 different Hebrew textual traditions for portions of these texts. But they're not divided up along these source critical lines. That doesn't mean they didn't exist in these forms originally, okay? So when I got involved in graduate work as a doctoral student, I became very interested in, what is the sociology of this discipline? How did this get going? And I began to see a lot of political, theological, and philosophical influences on the history of these theories. Not just this theory, but lots of these theories, okay? And that's not a bad thing, and that's not different than theological readings. Except I was being told by my professors that these were more objective methods in contrast to theological readings, right? That you have theological readings that are biased, and then you have scientific readings, all right? And so, I remember in one doctoral exam I had, one of the professors was quite angry, and he made the comparison with dropping the atom bomb. And he said, maybe we should not have dropped the atom bomb, but we know how to split an atom, the physics works. And he was comparing hypothetical literary theories for studying history with nuclear physics. I thought that was an inappropriate analogy. It was a poor analogy. Then I came across the work of Pope Benedict XVI before he was Pope, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. In 1988, he had delivered a lecture in New York City called Biblical Interpretation in Crisis. And what he argued, and this became in a sense the inspiration for much of my work as a scholar, is he argued that scholars need to take a critical gaze at their own discipline to uncover philosophical roots of the methods we use, historical roots, theological influences, political, and understand its limits. What can these methods teach us that's helpful? How can they function helpfully, heuristically, in pointing out important insights? And where are their limits? And so that's a lot of what I do. So let me transition into the book. Okay, so in the book, you can roughly divide this book into 3 parts. The first part, in the first 3 chapters, we survey roughly 150 years of scholarship challenging the documentary hypothesis from the get-go, coming from Jewish scholars like Umberto Cassuto, Catholic scholars like Augustin Bea, was trained at the University of Berlin, taught at the Biblicum in Rome, evangelical Protestant scholars, right, like Kenneth Kitchen and others, and other Protestant scholars as well. So we go through about 150 years of mostly ancient Near Eastern scholars and other Bible scholars who have posed challenges with what was the dominant reigning view in the academy. So we're kind of giving voice to a minority of scholarship that is often ignored or forgotten. So that's what that first third does. The second third, I think, is really interesting, and that's mostly John Bergsma's work. And that is to look at new arguments for the antiquity and unity of the Pentateuch. By antiquity, I'm not talking about second millennium. We're not denying second millennium, but we're not going that far. We're arguing pre-Babylonian exile. So I think what we're doing is very limited, okay? Because I think it's very hard to make, not impossible, but it's very hard to make a wholesale case beyond that time period. So we're trying to be very limited in what we do. Okay, so we're arguing that the bulk of the Pentateuch, the Torah, dates from before the Babylonian exile, not after. Before the 6th century, not in the 5th or 4th. Okay? I mean, that doesn't sound like it's a lot, but in some circles it's like you believe unicorns that float, flap their wings. So it is kind of controversial. And the other is unity, primarily unitary authorship. So what do we find, what's significant here? What is the evidence of the Samaritans, which I think is very overlooked? In 1911, J. Iverak Monroe wrote a very important book on the Samaritan Pentateuch and what it has to say about these theories. It's all but forgotten, and there's problems. He has to revisit his work. But he made the remarkable discovery that people knew, that the Samaritan Pentateuch you would expect to be just E. If the Samaritans are descendants of the Northerners, okay, why would they take P and D, especially if P and D didn't exist until after the Babylonian exile? Why would they come back and expand their Pentateuch? Now, there are arguments for why they might. People do argue that. Alfred Loisy, who's a figure I work a lot on, made an argument for that. Wilhelm de Wet mentioned this in a footnote in a very short piece he wrote that was groundbreaking for the date of Deuteronomy and the discovery of this by Josiah, during the time of Josiah. Okay, so that's, there are people who respond to this. We don't think it's very persuasive, so that's why we say, this is actually a pretty important argument that most scholars ignore, they don't address. The other problem is more substantial, and that's Ezekiel. If Ezekiel, as most scholars contend, is from the exile, he seems very clearly aware of both the final form of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, both P and H sources. And probably the best piece on this, my co-author John Bergsma and Scott Hahn published in the Journal of Biblical Literature back in 2004 on Ezekiel 20. They had a very careful read of Ezekiel 20 showing how it's cued in to passages that are attributed to P and H in Leviticus, as well as Deuteronomy, texts that supposedly were not written yet, and then it's challenging Deuteronomy based on its profanation of priestly legislation. For example, the profane slaughter of animals. Right? That's a very technical piece that we deal with here. That's important. But one of the biggest issues is the absence of a Zion theology in the Pentateuch. Okay, so part of the argument, both for D and J, is that it's supporting Zion. It's supporting Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. And yet there's not a single reference, explicit reference, to Jerusalem in the entire Pentateuch. The closest thing you have is Genesis 14 with its reference to Salem, which later we know in the Psalms and Chronicles becomes Mount Zion. Okay? But that's the closest we have. The central sanctuary in Deuteronomy, which is one of the biggest differences between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Jewish Pentateuch, is not Jerusalem. It's Mount Ebal, which is by Shechem in the north. Right? So the Samaritans have Mount Gerizim, because the argument is that Mount Gerizim is where the temple should be for Samaritans, whereas in Judaism and in Christian tradition, the temple is supposed to be in Jerusalem. Okay? But Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are both in the north. Why would a southern kingdom support a northern central sanctuary? But most importantly, when we have pro-Zion theological texts in the Old Testament from the time of Josiah or elsewhere, Jerusalem and Mount Zion are mentioned all over the place. Just look at the prophets. If the Pentateuch is, as Wellhausen famously quipped, after the prophets, why is there zero explicit reference to Jerusalem or to Zion? I think that's pretty important. The remaining third of what we do, which is one of my most important contributions here, is to meticulously walk through the early and often unexamined history of this theory, going back to Roman and Gnostic challenges of Mosaic authorship and of a revelation at Mount Sinai, going into later medieval Muslim scholarship. I think it's legitimate to call it scholarship. It was very erudite, especially the figure of Ibn Hazm. And then going forward into the medieval period, the Reformation, and the various enlightenments in Europe. Long before you have a University of Göttingen, long before you have Julius Wellhausen writing his Prolegomena, you already have a development of source-critical theories that they build upon, which are important for this scholarship. But most important is they're not absent a political interest, theological interest, or philosophical interest. And that brings me to the final portion of what I want to talk about, is how do we engage in this? Right? In my context, I would say that in the Guild, it's very difficult to broach certain topics, even as simple as a pre-Babylonian date for Genesis 1, for example. Okay, John Walton did a really important book on Genesis 1 and other ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies. And he mentions, Babylonian influences in the text, but he mentions a lot of New Kingdom Egyptian influences as well. And those tend to be ignored by scholars. And if you argue for something like that, it really is like I believe in flying unicorns and things like that. And I'm reminded of a quotation I'll give you with from Emil Durkheim in his Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 1912. This is what he says, and I think this is what we have to caution against. If we're going to take history seriously, if we're going to take scholarship seriously, theological or not, he says the following: just as society consecrates men, so it also consecrates things, including ideas. When a belief is shared unanimously by a people, to touch it, that is to deny it or question it, is forbidden. The prohibition against critique is a prohibition like any other, and that proves that one is face to face with a sacred thing, end quote. I bring that up because I think guilds inherently are conservative. I don't mean that in a positive sense or a negative sense, just descriptive. They don't meet change easily. So we think about things like paradigm shifts. I think what we're beginning to see in Pentateuchal studies is paradigms beginning to shift with younger scholars, right? Whether they're Jewish, like Joshua Berman, Protestant, Catholic. There's beginning to be a sea change among Pentateuchal scholars. And I think it's important that we allow the arguments to be voiced and had. What I also think is important is in any discipline that's scholarly, whether it's chemistry, history, whatever it is, it's really important to know the limits of what we're trying to do. Again, I think we're attempting that here. That's why we both think the bulk of the Pentateuch goes back to the second millennium. We do think that, both John and I know that. We both think that Israel was in Egypt at some point. We're not arguing for that here, right? Because we don't think we have a robust enough case to do that. So we're trying to be limited in what do we think we can argue persuasively at this point, okay? And I think that's important for all of us to do. When we make an argument about a method for interpreting Scripture or whatever, it's good to know the limits of what we're actually positing. I think this goes for every field. What are my limits? So I think we need to do that. I think it's important to engage in history without neglecting the insights of tradition. All right, so one of the things in my courses, I engage a lot with rabbinic biblical interpretation. I engage a lot with early Christian, the church fathers, early Christian biblical interpretation. I don't agree with everything I find, but I often find insights of careful readings of the text I'll give one example. I'll give one example from somebody I'm much more expert in, and that is Baruch Spinoza. Right? So Spinoza's 1670 Tractatus Theologico Politicus, I think, is very important in the founding of a method like this. Chapter 7, I think, is an important blueprint that, whether Bible scholars today recognize it or not, is in a sense the marching orders for much of modern biblical criticism. I don't like a lot of what Spinoza does in his theological political treatise, but he has really interesting insights in the Sinai narratives when he talks about the replacement of the elders, which he identifies as the firstborn sons of Israelite families, with the Levites. Something that my reading of Leviticus and Numbers especially drives home. That when you have the censuses being taken of Israel, first the families but not the Levites, then the firstborn sons, and what's given to the firstborn sons is now given to the Levites, because the Lord is choosing the Levites in place of the firstborn sons. That makes sense of the text. And it makes sense of why in Genesis you mostly find fathers and either their firstborn sons or later born sons like Jacob, who are given the status of firstborn sons, offering blessings, receiving blessings, and offering sacrifice, engaging in priestly activity, the very sort of priestly activity you have the Levites and the sons of Aaron doing after the worship of the golden calf. Okay? This insight of Spinoza is also found throughout rabbinic commentaries. And if you go earlier with the Targums, right, the Aramaic interpretations, the Aramaic translations, they also have glosses, so they do interpretive work. The Aramaic translations of the Torah and others, you see several of them mentioning explicitly that the Zikanim, the elders, in Exodus 24, are none other than the firstborn sons, who are there because they've been ransomed in the Passover to serve not the Pharaoh, but to serve the Lord. Not in servitude, but in priestly ministry. And this is something I see as an insight in Spinoza that's not unique. But it's a way in which he's reading the text as his forebears had as well. So I think it's important as we engage in scholarly debate and scholarly study to reap the best fruits of the tradition, Jewish, Christian, and other, as well as the best of modern scholarship. And I think it's important when we're talking about history to go where the evidence leads on a historical matter, right? And that often will mean we don't know. We don't know. Right? Why do I say that? I'm going to stress that. Right? This is a line you'll hear mostly from evangelical Protestants. Right? I'm Catholic, but I think it's a really good line. And that is this. Archaeological evidence, the absence of archaeological evidence is not the same thing as the positive evidence of absence. Okay, I'll say it one more time in a different way. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's particularly the case with ancient history and with the archaeological record. Why? Because, as Ed Yamauchi pointed out in his 1972 The Stones and the Scriptures, of all that once existed, only a fragment has remained to the present. Right? Parchment dissolves. Towns get destroyed in warfare. Okay? Material remains often desiccate over the millennia. Right? Of the sites and locations that once existed where these remains are, only a fragment have been discovered. We're continually discovering new sites. There's places we know that existed that we don't know where they are. In most cases, when we look at those sites, only a fragment of them have been excavated. In places like Jerusalem, people still live there. You can imagine doing an archaeological excavation of New York City. It's difficult. Of what has been uncovered, only a very small fragment has been examined by scholars. And you can just think about the case of cuneiform literature, whether you're talking about Hittite, Akkadian, Sumerian, Ugaritic, right? Hundreds of thousands of fragmentary and very large cuneiform documents have been found. In the Western Hemisphere, probably none more than what you have in the Yale Babylonian collection. Okay, but they're all over the world. Very, very few, over 25,000, have been read by scholars. Well, where are you going to go get a PhD in Assyriology? Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, Penn. But there are not a lot of schools. You can get PhDs at Seton Hall. You can't get a PhD in Assyriology. Right? Can you get one at Princeton? I don't know. You might be able to. I'm not sure. But there's very few schools in the Western Hemisphere where you can get a PhD in Akkadian and study this material. There's not a market for it. There's no money in it. And money drives so much of this. Of what's been examined by scholars, only a fragment has been published. And of what's been published, how many students or non-students, popular people, have read that small fragment? Who reads the Journal of Cuneiform Studies or Near Eastern Studies? People do. But what I'm saying is, Father Zach, when was the last time you read the Journal of Cuneiform Studies? Right? So what we're dealing with, especially when we see the talking heads on TV, is a fragment of 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 what once existed. In light of such a fragmentary record, absence of evidence can never be equated with evidence of absence. And the Bible, not always, but often does very well when comparative data is available. Right? We don't have a lot in the time period of the Pentateuch. But we do, for example, with the kings after the divided kingdom, with the Assyrian records from the Assyrian kings. Okay? So I want to make sure there's time for question, but what I would say is this, and this is my own position, okay? Everybody's free to challenge me. In Behold the Pierced One, Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, said, and this is my experience as well, that quite often the tradition itself does a better job, he says on scientific grounds, I would say, on scholarly grounds, okay, on scholarly grounds, of accounting for what we find in the text than many of these more skeptical, hypothetical literary theories. I'll leave you with that. We have a lot of time for questions. Thank you very much. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. It is a complicated topic.
Good question. You sort of touched on it at the start where you were talking about the existence of different sort of like textual traditions of the Samaritan Pentateuch and the sort of Masoretic text and Septuagint being sort of the main ones. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how these sort of different textual traditions will shape your approach to sort of looking at authorship, and then sort of beyond that, how I think maybe sometimes like people of faith might sort of feel worried when they see the existence of like multiple recensions that, you know, sometimes makes people feel concerned about the authenticity of the text. And so how can like something like that be approached?
That's an excellent, excellent question. There's a lot there. I'm going to repeat it as best as I can, and help me if I'm not getting it. The question revolves around the multiple textual traditions, and we're just focusing on the Hebrew textual traditions because if you get into other translations, there's a lot more. The multiple, at least 3 Hebrew textual traditions we have at Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how that relates to my questions, my views on authorship, 1. And then 2, how do people of faith deal with that? Because some people might be concerned, okay? And that's going to be, that right there is a complicated, which faith? That's going to be complicated. Those are the bulk of your questions? Okay, the first one, it doesn't impinge a whole lot on my view of authorship, right? Because it's not about composition of texts, right? So I don't know if I wouldn't see it as directly relevant to the question of actual authorship. It has to do a lot more with scribal traditions. And so, and what I will say about that is this, is that for a long time in the history of looking at these texts, scholars privileged what we'll call the Masoretic text, which is the main Hebrew recension that we have throughout the entire medieval period to today, okay? You can think of like the Leningrad Codex, for those who know, is like one of the main ones. So if anybody studies Hebrew, you're going to be getting probably the Biblia Hebraica Stucartensia as your main primary text. Now we have the Quinta, right? Biblia Hebraica Quinta, because it's incorporating the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Am I, yeah, okay. I don't want to make sure I'm not losing people. Do a lot of people are confused though? Biblia, April, do you know the Biblia Hebraica Stucartensia? No, that's okay. So what this is if you're looking at a text, so this is the question of when you're reading the text, and what I had to do with my students, we're reading Genesis, and it's not in English, right? So this is not a joke. I wish this were a joke, but I was at a Wendy's once, and this is like 20, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And this lady said, look, if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus and the apostles, it's good enough for me. And King James is a beautiful translation. I think it's really good in a lot of places, especially with the Hebrew Bible. But the idea, obviously, the King James English being used by the Jesus and the apostles is obviously problematic. I don't think I need to explain that to anybody here. So students have to understand that there's a Hebrew text behind this, that our English translations, most of them, are based on a Hebrew text. Well, which one? You're not, people are not, right, even now, they're not going and comparing manuscripts. There are textual critics who do that, but translators are by and large not doing that. Maybe some of you do if you're in the work of translation. Most of my friends who translate do not. Ed Yamauchi, when he helped with an NIV translation, did not. He was using the Biblia Hebraica Stucartensia. So you have a text that's the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. And then it has a critical apparatus. It has what we might call footnotes. And they show what many of the major different manuscripts have in them, the different textual traditions that are there, and differences you find in the manuscripts. And I was always struck by Moshe Gottstein, I think it was 1982 or 83, he wrote a wonderful article in Journal of Biblical Literature on Old Testament textual criticism. And this was a shock for me. And he said, this was meant to be a text for students, not scholars. Scholars were to go to the libraries and compare the texts themselves, the Syriac Peshitta and the Septuagint and the Leningrad Codex and all the different variants, and make their own decisions. And people like Wellhausen did that. Johann Gottfried Eichhorn did that. Johann Michaelis did that. These figures did that. That's an overwhelming task, and it would be very expensive with plane fares and things like that. So what's happened is, in a sense, we've dumbed down scholarship and made it more accessible and doable. So we have this text, but it's primarily based on the Masoretic text. And so what would we do with the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which is one of the most popular Greek translation? It differs all over the place. And so scholars say, well, that's just a bad translation of the Hebrew text. With the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we recognize now, oh, there are whole Hebrew textual traditions that seem to match what we would expect in the Septuagint and not in the Masoretic text, where they disagree. And so there seems to be what you might call a proto-Septuagintal Hebrew tradition. It's not necessarily the case the Septuagint is always just a poor translation, but it might be using different manuscripts, okay? Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritan tradition is also present at Qumran. So the Samaritan tradition has a Pentateuch in Samaritan Aramaic and in Samaritan Hebrew, okay? Okay, so hopefully I'm not making this too complicated. So what does this do for people of faith? It depends on your faith tradition. So if you're, and this is, in my opinion, if you look at some of the most vocal, really serious skeptics who publish a lot more than me and make a lot more money on their books than I do, and they're very serious. I mean, I just think of Bart Ehrman, for example. He's very famous, and he went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and he worked with Bruce Metzger. And he's very good. He's a very good textual critic. I don't like his books. I don't think they're always very good scholarship, but some of them are. So, and his scholarly work in textual criticism, and I'm an amateur in that field, is very good. But he talks about being scandalized by the textual tradition. And so if your faith tradition is one where, we have a text and it's exactly the text we have in the Hebrew and Greek, is what the apostles wrote, and is what, right? And we have that here, the autographed copies. That's going to be a very difficult thing to reconcile. And it's not something that most of our forebears had a problem with. Even St. Augustine, who claims to not have known Hebrew and not have really known Greek, understood there were two Hebrew textual traditions because he was aware of the Vetus Latina, the old Latin tradition of its translation, and he was a contemporary of St. Jerome and the Vulgate, and he knew both. And when he came to the book of Isaiah, for example, and I'm stealing this from Michael Legaspi from a presentation he made at SBL many years ago, he recognized that the Latin in the Vetus Latina of Isaiah and in the Vulgate is different in places. And his response is we have to take them into account theologically. We don't know what the original would have been. And so we can't ignore, right, the work of the translators. Are they inspired? Not in the way somebody in like a common sense enlightenment philosopher might say, not in the way that an American evangelical, a part of the Evangelical Theological Society of America might be comfortable with. But that's how St. Augustine dealt with it. He knew about these things. Origen knew about different textual traditions. The church fathers knew this. The rabbis knew this. Medieval theologians knew this, right? All of these Christians and Jews throughout the ages knew this, and they had responses. If your faith requires that the text you have in front of you is every word, every letter, etc., that is going to be a challenge. I'm a Catholic, so for my faith doesn't require that. Does that make sense? I don't know. It's a complicated one because it will cause some people challenges. And that's where I think we get a lot of, I don't like the terms fundamentalist, even evangelical. These can be problematic terms because they become catch-alls, right, for lots of different things. But that is where we find a lot of skeptics coming from, those positions. And as they learn about these things, it does cause a crisis of faith, often. That's a good question. I didn't give a very good answer, but that is a good question. Other questions? I'll try not to be so long-winded. Please.
So I wonder what you make, this is more in the sources and the history of I wonder what you make of scholars like Joshua Berman and debates about how texts were woven together in the ancient Near East. With reference, biblical scholars in the 19th century were looking to other texts that they had previously figured out were, woven together. And so, I guess, what do you make of this interpretation for the Bible in the light of work like Berman, who I believe has pointed to examples of Egyptian stelae victories that were written contemporaneous with the victory, but incorporating multiple perspectives. And that sort of throws a wrench into the idea that you would need multiple eras and different voices in order to compose one text, where there are obviously narratives where that seems to be happening. The flood narrative, there seem to be two very clear voices that can be extracted from one another. So what do you make of his interpretation in light of the fact that we do, in some cases, have texts that were drawn together from multiple sources, and you have cases where it was clearly one source that wrote two voices?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to repeat it just because I don't know if that picked up. The question is about the work of Joshua Berman, and what do I make of his work? He's alluding to, especially, I believe, Berman's Inconsistencies in Torah, which I think is one of the most important books on the topic, far more important than this one, in fact. I think it really is one of the most important contributions that's been made ever, I would say, actually, on this question. So that partly answers your question about, and I'll explain some of the things that you mentioned in passing. I think I'm a huge fan of Joshua Berman. In fact, I think he blurbed the book. He did. He blurbed the book. I was really happy. I'm serious. I was very happy about that. His work, I think, is incredibly important. I was very moved by his article. I forget the date. It feels recent, but it's probably not that recent. In Journal of Biblical Literature on, might have been 2013, but it was on Deuteronomy 13 and its Hittite provenance in the second millennium BCE. It was amazing. So I'm a huge fan. I felt a little miffed that, this is positive, that he gave this amazing presentation at SBL on Ibn Hazm's work. And then he published it in JBL. I've been working at Ibn Hazm in English translation, I believe, long before, since 2005. In fact, when I was still a doctoral student, I started working at Ibn Hazm's work, 2004, excuse me. And so I was like, he got there before I could. But I think he's amazing. I think he's a forerunner of what's to come, and he is, I would say, the tip of the spear in the shift in what I'm hoping to be a shift in Pentateuchal source criticism. So what do I make then of his inconsistency in Torah? I actually reviewed that for Nova Vetera, and they let me do a really lengthy review because I thought it was such an important book. They wanted like 6 pages, I think even like 13, and they let me do it because it was so important. What Berman does, and he's competent in the languages in a way I am not. And I mean, he doesn't read Arabic, he says, but he does read Egyptian and Hittite and these other ancillary ancient Near Eastern languages that he's working with, which are really impressive. And what he does is he shows exactly what you said, that the Egyptians and others were quite comfortable putting up one relief, a stele, for example, in prose and one in poetry that didn't, fit in a way we moderns would like them to fit nicely and neatly, much like what we find in the Pentateuch, for example. And what this does, number one, is it shows one of the points that we're making is this does not require multiple sources from later dates, far from the events. But actually, this is pretty typical how ancient Near Easterners wrote. It's very common. I will go forward and say, in fact, authorially, as he says, like in this case, he's using the example of Ramses II and Tutmosis III. They're the commissioners. You have the same commissioner commissioning, in some level having authorial authority. The same commissioner commissioning 2 different types, or in some cases 3, about the same event that don't have what we would think of as modern expectations of consistency, and very comfortable with hyperbole and things that we're not comfortable with when we talk about modern history. And so I think it's very important in understanding ancient historiography. And I think that is actually one of the fundamental problems with a lot of these theories. You may or may not know, for those of you familiar with Wellhausen, he knew Akkadian. As Peter Machinist at Harvard pointed out in a wonderful essay, The Road Not Taken, or The Path Not Taken, Julius Wellhausen in Assyriology, he was this close to becoming an Assyriologist as opposed to a Bible scholar as his main career, And he chose not to. He chose instead to go to Scripture. But apart from Arabic, he examined the text in all but a complete vacuum. And he did so by design, unlike Berman, who's looking at what do other ancient Near Eastern cultures, how do they write history? Wellhausen didn't care. That wasn't important to him. And I think that's important. So this is an important corrective that, it's very common to have prose and poetic sources together in the ancient Near East as we find them in the Bible. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think I would like to know if you lean one way or the other. I'm curious whether you would lean one way or the other towards interpreting the Bible as multiple sources. I think,
Okay.
The Enuma Elish maybe is also assumed to be the same way, or if it was one author or one commissioner who had multiple voices.
Sure. The question is, where do I personally lean? And John and I are pretty similar on this, even though we don't go into it in the text that much. Do I lean in a primary author, one author, multiple authors? We both lean in primary authorship. Actually, we both personally think that somebody like a Moses figure has the best claim. Not necessarily every line, every yod, in the text. But I think remember when in 2003 when Kenneth Kitchen pointed out, gosh, this material knows Semitic customs from the 2nd millennium so well, and it knows ancient Egyptian treaty types and diplomacy so well, Somebody like a Moses figure who has a foot in both worlds would need to be invented to come up with what we find in the text on historical grounds, except we already have him provided for us. That I lean in that direction. I do think that seems to be the best, evidence of the text. And, I could go, again, with Gary Rensburg, did a piece on the patriarchal narratives. It's an aside. He just has this as an aside. I think it's pretty good. And it said, why do we have all these priestly concerns elsewhere? Well, again, Moses is a Levite, for crying out loud. And his older brother Aaron is the first high priest. And so I do think that makes sense. And when you look at there's more and more discussion of a priestly editor for those who engage in these source critical discussions. And that makes sense to me, right? Because if you look in these so-called priestly portions in Genesis 1, which clearly have themes of temple building and tabernacle building and parallels going on there, you find something similar in Genesis 2 and 3, right, that are not priestly, right? So the Garden of Eden is entered to the east, just like the temple tabernacle is entered into the east. You have the precious stones. You have Adam, right? Adam is told to avad and shamar. Those two verbs only occur together again in the Pentateuch with the role of the Levites in the tabernacle. And in the entire Torah, in the entire Hebrew Bible with the priests in the temple, right? And so it's not weird then when we find early rabbis saying that Adam, right, offered incense sacrifices in the garden. Why? Because he of avodah and shamar, because he was guarding and tilling. And those two verbs, these rabbinic interpreters understood as priestly. So they're saying the incense, I'm not going to stick it, I don't think it's incense offering, but they're picking up on some insight that I think is there. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense. Are there other hands? Almost certainly. And I think we can see this as development goes on. Glosses, etc., I think has to explain the text. I'll go back to Cyrus Gordon's comment. He wrote this, although a Jewish scholar, I think it was 1959, in Christianity Today, right? Which is, at the time, would have been very well described as a conservative evangelical Protestant periodical. Cyrus Gordon, secular Jewish scholar, he wrote a piece on their higher critics and forbidden fruit. It's a great piece. And he goes in there and he's like, I was taught all of this stuff, J-E-D and P. And I know Akkadian, and I would have learned Egyptian, but Albright said, too many languages already, I'm not going to teach you Egyptian. So then I got hired to teach Egyptian, and I didn't bother telling them I didn't know it. So I taught hieroglyphs, I taught Demotic, I taught hieratic, and eventually I became, a scholarly Egyptologist and directed dissertations in Egyptology. Scholars of a different breed, right? But Gordon said, when I'm teaching the Epic of Gilgamesh in the original Akkadian, and I'm like, if I'm going to we have very similar accounts to what we have with Noah. If this is P for Israel, it's got to be P for Enum Elish. It doesn't make any sense. The shift from the narrative to the construction just doesn't fit. And so obviously, I would say there are different hands throughout. I don't think they fit these neat, tidy patterns. Yes?
I have a question.
Please.
Hi, so it's not really a scholarly question. It's more like touching on your imagination as the author of your book. So how do you imagine Moses to have written the 5 books of the Pentateuch? I mean, he must have written it during the 40 years in the wilderness. So when you're deep into your research and writing about Mosaic authorship, how do you just envision him? Yeah.
As an excellent...
Writing from the primeval history, ancestral history, especially the creation account and flood account. Yeah. He's not in there.
Right. Excellent. Excellent question. This is how would I then envision Moses' role in the Pentateuch in light of my studies. So first of all, this is a tricky question because we're not really arguing that, even if we're persuaded by that. And we're not arguing that because I don't think we can make a robust case for it, even if I think probability leans in that direction. So how would I envision it? I would envision it as in part writing about his experiences, but how do you deal with what was before? And this very question is actually what sparks using letters and focusing on dividing the text based on vocabulary and style, right? It's in 1753 in Jean Austruc's Conjecture sur la jeunesse. He's the surgeon for King Louis XV. And he wants to defend Mosaic authorship against 17th century figures like Baruch Spinoza, Richard Simon, Isaac Laperrière, and Thomas Hobbes, who I work on. Those are figures I'm much more comfortable with. And what Austruc does is he says, well, we got to figure this out because Moses obviously wrote this, but he obviously couldn't have written, he wasn't around for Genesis. So Austruc comes up with 2 major sources which become J and E. and I think 11, now the number's escaping me, but I believe it's 11 minor sources. It's been a long time since I've worked through that book. So I think it's 13 sources altogether. And he lays down a method for identifying them based on vocabulary. And then that gets built upon when Eichhorn, well, that's not your question, so I won't go there. I can go on that for a long time. But so your question, so I would imagine him having the oral traditions of his family that are passed down and reworking them in light of the overarching concerns of what God has called him to do. Right? So I actually think that you can see, like, the focus of the land, right, I think is very important for the text. But it's the focus on the land is a focus on a place of worship, so that there can be people worshiping the one God. And the call is outward looking. And it goes back to the blessing of the nations through Abraham's seed, that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through your seed. And so I think what's going on when he's talking about the creation account, for example, what's going on is he's thinking in terms of the world as a tabernacle. If he's given the blueprint for the tabernacle, then you can see that there's the parallels between the construction of the tabernacle, the blessing of the work, the blessing of the days, looking at the work, it is good, looking at the days and creation, it is good. And you can see God being depicted as building the world as a big sanctuary to be worshipped, because that's in a sense the point. And then the person, the human person, is made for worship. And so we see, I mean, my students always struggle with this. In fact, at the core course I'm teaching right now, the program doesn't, you have to stop at Exodus 24, which I kind of think is a travesty, but it's a great passage, don't get me wrong. But it's so important, the legislation that comes in, the building of the tabernacle, not one, but two accounts. Same with this, with the ark. I don't see these as two sources. I see them as announcement and fulfillment. That they're so important that you have God saying it needs to be done like this, and then you have the description of as it's being done. And I think the differences can be accounted by comments by people like Umberto Cassuto, right, or Arthur Quinn and Isaac Kikuwata, who in Before Abraham Was go through kind of the chiastic structure of the ark account and others, that this is, if it's editorship or whether it's authorship, you have really serious literary creativity going on at a very high, impressive level. And I think Moses is reflecting on this in the desert as this is happening. So that is my view, but that's not, that's very controversial. Please.
So I know that people date, or people will argue that books like Ecclesiastes are, like the date of those are much later because there's Persian loanwords. And so I'm wondering kind of what you generally think of the strategy of dating via, or dating using kind of language, and if that's something that comes up in your book, if that's something that's argued that's going on in the Pentateuch.
Excellent question about dating and language. This is really a tricky thing, especially tricky with things like Daniel and other passages. But so the dating, you specifically mentioned Ecclesiastes and Persian loanwords. Dating is really tricky, right? I think it's so. I'm not going to have anything that you're going to be like, oh, this is a smoking gun argument. I think dating with words is really tricky because, on the one hand, what you can say for sure is that one of two things happens when you find a word in a text, right? And this doesn't tell you the answer, right? Either it shows that the text is coming from a time period where that word occurs, right? Or it's showing you that this is an early occurrence of the word. It doesn't tell you a whole lot. But it's very tricky because, so what do you do with texts that purport to be old, that have a lot of archaisms in them, but clearly have later material, later words? And I think it's difficult to know. Is this because the text dates late? Maybe it has a vestige that's early, that's archaic, that preserves some of this archaic material? Or is it early? And scribes or whomever are passing it on are updating so that it makes sense. As an amateur in that, and I'm an amateur in that, my general take would be when you have a preponderance of archaisms, right, to put it archaic. And if some things seem to be updated, right, for a later readership, scribal emendation makes lots of sense there. And we have a lot of parallels in the ancient Near East from that. And we see this in the writings of Alan Millard and Kenneth Kitchen, Richard Hess. They've done work on that, and they've shown exactly how scribal traditions function like that. So we can assume that sometimes. But I would be very cautious. We don't want to overstretch the evidence. So I would say you have to be careful with loan words. I would say, for example, when you have things that seem to be, say, Egyptian in background, if they don't come up very late in first millennium sources, but you have a preponderance of them in second millennium sources, and you have them in a text that takes place in the second millennium, it does seem reasonable, I think, to see that as fitting better in early second millennium context with maybe some later emendation going on. But it would be a case-by-case piece. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what I would say. I would be cautious.
Thank you so much for your lecture. My question is a little bit broader with regards to the historical critical reading of Scripture. And I'm thinking specifically about the question of the position that lay people have in reading Scripture as divine revelation when it comes to the Old Testament. So Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Father, for having revealed these things to mere children." Mm-hmm. But it looks like the contemporary academic world of biblical scholarship seems to suggest that unless we understand the historical context in which the text has been written, we're positioned at a lower level than biblical scholars to understand the text as divine revelation. So I guess another way of putting the question is, what's the significance of history and historical context in understanding the text as divine revelation?
Very important question. I'm going to answer it as a Catholic, if that's okay, because it's easy, because it's easier. It's much more difficult, I think, if you don't, have as robust a tradition like that. At some level, it won't matter as much in some traditions. It really depends on the tradition. But for me, as a Catholic theologian, it's easier, I think. So the question is, what do we do? It seems like historical criticism. It seems like the Bible's a book for specialists. What are average people to do, right? And so what is the role of history? And I would say, at least from a Catholic perspective, it's a book for the people, obviously. Right? This is a book, right, from a Catholic perspective, this is God's love letter to us, to people, created in God's image and likeness. And so learning history, learning languages can only help you. But it's not a book for specialists. Right? And so if the text, for example, is to be so the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraphs 115 and 119 go through the kind of the traditional fourfold interpretation, the quadruple senses, really two levels, literal and spiritual. And then following Thomas Aquinas, it divides the spiritual into typology or allegory, tropology, the moral sense, and the anagogical sense. And that becomes, in a sense, easier in the sense of the more you bring to bear on the text, the more you can get out of it. But you're not limited to that. Why? Right? As the Orthodox rabbi, I can't remember his first name, but Hirsch, in the 19th century, wrote a great line where he says, "The liturgy is the Jewish catechism." Right? The liturgy of the synagogue is the catechism for Judaism. Well, that's as true for Christianity, for Catholicism. It's as true. Right? That the liturgy, in a sense, is our catechism. Where do we encounter Scripture? In the liturgy. We encounter it, right, Old and New Testament put together that facilitate a natural typological interpretation. When I say typology, I'm talking about reading the Old Testament in light of Jesus, the sacraments, the church in the New. Right? So St. Augustine had that famous line, "The new is hidden in the old, and the old is made manifest in the new." Well, you get that quite naturally at the liturgy, all right? As the first reading and then the second reading and the gospel leading into the celebration of the Eucharist. So that's what I would say at first is it's not to be fideistic. We have to use reason. We want to understand the text. But if you don't understand the culture and the history of the time, right, you do have an aid you have an aid from a Catholic theological perspective. This is fundamentally about God as Trinity, right? And I know this is obviously controversial. That's why this is speaking from a Catholic perspective, right? God is Trinity. Well, a scholar might say, well, that's an impediment to the truth of Scripture. Whatever the truth is we have to kind of bracket our faith tradition. Well, as a Catholic theologian, I think that no, actually, the dogmatic tradition is like lenses that I can't. And this is, it helps clarify for me the degree to which it's true. If it's not true, obviously it obscures. But if, as I believe, if it's true, well, how can it not but clarify, right? Does that make sense? I mean, so I would say it's not that this is a book for the scholars. What scholarship tries to do is what the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation from the Second Vatican Council, Dei Verbum, tried to mention in paragraph 12, and that is that we have to take the human authors of Scripture seriously, right? Because the Catholic Church teaches there's a dual authorship. God is the primary author, but the sacred human authors are real authors, right? God moved them to write. God inspired them. They didn't write what God didn't want them to write, right? But they only could write what they could know about. Okay, so therefore, genre is very important. Language is very important. The original languages, what do these terms mean, right? All of these things are important to study, the history, cultural expressions of the time, just to understand the literal sense of the text. And all the spiritual senses are grounded in the literal. So I always tell my students, do Catholics believe that you have to read the Bible literally? And they're like, no. I say, yes. Right? But what does that mean? Not necessarily literalistically. You got to take into account genre, all of these things, right? And so the spiritual senses are grounded in the literal. You have to understand the sense of the words, as St. Thomas Aquinas said in Summa Theologiae. The sense of the words, not authorial intent, that's the modern quest, right? But the sense of the words. And from there we can go and build and see how this can be fruitful in my life. David Steinmetz, who's a Protestant scholar of the history of interpretation, primarily the Reformation period and primarily of Calvin, also of Luther, and he said that really, and I think he's right, he says that really Calvin and Luther didn't really so much do away with typology and tropology. They compressed it into the literal sense. So their literal sense is expanded. It does a lot of the work that for medievals typology in the moral sense did. And so it's kind of compressed in there. And I think that's fundamentally right, the little I know of Calvin and Luther's biblical interpretation. So what I would say is don't be afraid of the text. But from a Catholic perspective, you should be reading it in light of the dogmatic tradition of the Church, which is inspired by God, right? The decrees of the ecumenical councils. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is a handy compendium of Catholic teaching. The liturgy itself helps facilitate those readings. And that becomes our primary lens through which we read the text. And what the historical scholarship in its best case will do will help us get at the literal sense. And so I always, this is maybe simplistic. It is simplistic. It may be overly simplistic. But what I always tell people who, from a Catholic perspective, who are interested in getting more out of the text, interrogate it with these really important questions. Who, what, where, when, how, and why. Right? If you can't always answer those questions. But when you can, it's time to sit up. Where are they? When is this taking place? If the Feast of Passover is nearby, the author's trying to tell you, think about that in this context. And so those sorts of questions, they seem simple, but they're really helpful. And I'm only 45 years old. That's younger than some of you and older than a lot of you. And I've been reading Scripture. I entered the church Easter Vigil of 1999, became an evangelical actually in 97, became Catholic in 99. And I've been reading the Bible since then daily, and it's always new for me. Literally, it's always new. I've been working through Lamentations right now. I don't know how many times I've read Lamentations, you pick a book in the Bible, I don't know how many times I've read it. And even today, reading Lamentations just on my own for a few minutes, I'm finding something new connections with Jeremiah, new connections with the New Testament, new personal connections with trial and tribulation. It's not the same as the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, but you can relate. And I just think that's really important. I don't want people to think this is a book for ivory tower academics, in which case I would be excluded. I'm not a Bible scholar. No Bible scholar recognizes me as a Bible scholar. I'm a scholar of how Loisy reads the Bible, and I'm a scholar of how Spinoza reads the Bible, and Isaac La Pereire. I know something about how they read the Bible, but that's really my competence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Professor Morrow.
Thank you.